Hello, beautiful people. I am Oliver Perrin for Semiagog, and I am joined today by Faust, who has been kind enough to come on to discuss with us his ideas about the United States and culture.
More specifically, high culture, but full culture as well. Yeah. So I kind of imposed myself, I guess, as I have a habit of doing, just being forward and saying, "Hello, I'll come on. I'll talk to you." I've been involved in the Dutch nationalist movement for a while, about 5 years now. At first, mostly in real life, and more and more online, because I think one thing we can learn from Americans actually is the fact that you do a lot better marketing and a lot better online strategizing, which the Dutch movement is good on the ground, but I'm probably the only YouTuber, especially one who does anything in English, and that's kind of an issue. I really hope that changes over time. But so I run a personal channel on my own name, Faust. That's more philosophical, about religion and physics, biology, the economy, that sort of thing. I have a Dutch channel as well, Dietze Bazuin, which is a lot more like Prager University, I guess. That was sort of the idea, to try and make a nationalist Prager University. That's a lot higher production value. I also publish a magazine, culture-focused magazine there. And culture is the reason I wanted to come on today.
Excellent. Well, I'm rather surprised to find that your model is Prager University, but it's an effective marketing operation, is it not?
Exactly. You got to copy what works, right? Even if it's not from people you necessarily agree with. At least when I used to be more into the sort of centrist content, I guess, Prager University was omnipresent, and people talk about it. Even in the Netherlands, like, we have political parties that use Prager University videos in their Twitter campaigns, so it works.
Interesting. Yes. Well, I mean, the Chinese, after having been nailed so many times by the steppe nomads themselves, adopted trousers and mounted warfare, right? So there it is. Well, as I understand it, you wanted to talk to us in general about issues that arise, problems that occur with culture, and its rise and its development against a background of empire. And as I understand it, your view is that the United States is, in fact, at this point, one of those empires, and that this has had a negative impact on its culture.
Yes, indeed.
And
Yep.
I just wanted to say to our viewers, as I understand it, Faust is going to be coming up with a variety of examples. Of course, he is not speaking in his native language like so many Northwestern Europeans. He has excellent English. I expect that we're going to be talking about things like writers and all the rest. I hope that our audience will bear with him if, for example, he happens to miss some particular writer who might be most exemplary of something, or to include one when there might have been a better example. We have to bear in mind that, of course, he's moving outside his cultural sphere with American so-called high culture, since he's not an American. And so if he gets things right, that is what we should be celebrating, and we should be patient in that respect. So
that's a bit patronizing, but thank you.
Well, no, I'm thinking, I thought to myself last night, I didn't intend it to be patronizing at all, because I thought to myself, what would happen if someone asked me to comment upon a whole swath of culture in the Netherlands that would be considered as high culture?
Is your culture is, of course, much better known, and a lot of people outside the United States are quite familiar with some of your literature, especially your current culture, of course. So it's more common for a European to know about American culture, I think, than the reverse, probably.
Granted, however, I don't think it's all that common for Europeans to be deeply familiar with what sort of sayings are current in the United States, and whether or not some of those might have been drawn from literature or from folk traditions. I mean, in any case, please forgive me, it was not intended to be patronizing.
That's fine. Right, so the case I would present is that empires tend to be unable to produce high culture. And I'm taking this mostly from Spengler's writing. Spengler, of course, talks about cycles of civilization. And one of the examples I would give is, for example, it's not an original statement to compare the American or the USA with Rome. It's often done. But one of the things that people don't think about much when they talk about Rome is that Rome is known for legionaries, it's known for its roads, it's known for it's big building projects, but it's not very well known for its culture. If I were to ask you, for example, name me a Roman play or a Roman novel that isn't Virgil, who would you name?
Terence, Plautus.
Those are mostly historians.
I'm sorry. The Formio. What's his name? The formerly freed slave. It's not the self-hater.
The Stoic. Epicurus?
No. It's Terence. I believe that Terence is a playwright.
Okay.
But yes, I think the Formio is one of them. But your point is taken. I'm struggling to name you one. And of course, with Roman culture, the focus was much more on practicalities for the most part. And as I understand with their plays, they were fans of farce, and the Roman tradition of theater and stage was much more for what would later be called, like in the period of Shakespeare, the groundlings. The public that had to be kept happy with a steady flow of bread and circuses. Hence, the business of the Romans taking on Greek as their lingua franca and their cultural language to be able to engage in things. And in fact, the Romans would often mock people for taking too great an interest in Greek and things that were considered high culture. Figures like Cicero, for example, were often mocked for not being Roman enough, taking too much of an interest in things further east.
Yeah. Well, that's sort of the example I will give, is that a lot of their culture was Greek, was inspired on the Greeks and the Macedonians and so on. And you notice this in their architecture, but also the national play is, of course, the Aeneid by Virgil, which is just derivative of the Iliad. And what Spengler argues is that this sort of focus on material issues and inability to produce real, authentic culture comes with empire, because all of your best people are engaged in military business, are engaged as engineers. They don't have an inward look. They're not in their own sort of native land. They're outside. They're exploring, conquering, and so on. And all of the energy gets focused there. But it also happens simply over time. What he, for example, gives the presentation of the Iliad over time. But the Iliad originally just starts as a Manichaean story of good and bad. The Greeks triumph over the Trojans who wronged them by stealing Helen. But then later it becomes a story about the persons in the story. Ajax and Achilles and Agamemnon start taking a central stage. And by the end, it's all about the tragedies of these individual characters rather than it is about the real big story between the Greeks and the Trojans. So the morality starts sort of becoming individualized. And Spengler uses the example of the choir. So the original Greek theater is just the choir, where they sing the story. Then the choir, they add the characters as singers, as prominent on the first stage. And then by the end, by the late period, then you don't have the choir anymore. And he says this is sort of how culture goes, where first it is just a united effort from the entire culture that is vital, that doesn't question itself, that doesn't think about why it does things. For example, he says no culture can be built if the Athenians were to question why they enslaved their neighbors after conquering a city, for example. But it's inevitable in the late stage of a culture that people start questioning their own stories, their own morality, the righteousness of their own actions, and that's how a sort of a culture starts falling down. And then it also starts becoming more and more materialist. This is all Spengler. And I would argue that America is undergoing a sort of similar process where America's empire is built on Wall Street and the American military, and that's where most of the talented people in America go to finance and the army. Engineering, I guess, to some extent in STEM. And that's what's keeping the current order intact, and less goes into real culture. And what I would say is that America did have a fairly unique culture based on the national story of America, as I would see it, is the conquest of the wild, the civilization of the savages, and settling on unknown lands and so on. And you see this in a lot of the American literature. I think, for example, Melville's big theme is, of course, in Moby Dick, is fighting against nature, in a sense, against Moby Dick. You see it in Jack London with Call of the Wild, which is all about wolves in nature and so on. And you see this decreasing more and more as America starts realizing its power in the 20s and 30s. And after the Second World War, I think really this masculine idea of conquering and civilizing starts disappearing, and it becomes more and more individual and more liberal. That's more or less the premise I would go from.
And so the general idea is that empire, if I understood you correctly, creates a focus, an outward focus, yes, and a concomitant logistical focus. The sort of Eisenhower character responsible for making sure that the supply lines are taken care of, or let's call them the bean counters, who are calculating, for example, that a Sherman tank sucks compared to a Panzer or a Tiger tank, but they can be produced in large numbers, and they have interchangeable parts. And I think we see that with the rocket programs. Let's call them mid-century Germans. Essentially they were developing cruise missiles and fighter jets, and they were focusing on making each one of the examples that they produced as excellent as possible, whereas we were focusing on mass production. So you can see the sort of logistical concerns that are that were shared in the past by the Romans and the rest. And
also the questioning of your own culture also goes hand in hand with becoming empire, because conquering and oppressing other people starts gnawing at your own sense of morality. It happened with the Romans in the late stages, but with the Greeks, you could say it happened after Alexander, where they conquered most of the known world at the time, the oikomen. And that's where things start, where you have to enforce your own values on others through force. And at first it doesn't bother you so much, but slowly, eventually, it starts gnawing at the roots of your culture, and you start doubting if what you're doing is morally righteous. And you could say that perhaps that's the root of postmodernism.
Well, I would go so far as to say that it's like the old Archimedes statement. Give me a lever long enough and a place to stand, and I'll move the world. Or take a look, for example, at the way in which you only have a window to look into your own language and culture once you've stood outside of it, right? You need a reference point. If you haven't learned a second language, then you've never really looked at English, for example, from the outside. But to me, that seems a little bit more neutral a process than, for example, some inevitability inherent in the idea that once you have an empire, you begin to doubt yourself. I mean, the largest land empire ever known, if I'm not mistaken, was the Mongol. And we don't hear any stories about them questioning their values and their ways. Now, I'll grant you it was short-lived. But take a look at the British Empire. I mean, we've got a period running there, think about literature running from Burton's Anatomy of Melancholy all the way up to Orwell. A span of hundreds of years.
I would argue they were still in the process of conquering and hadn't really started questioning themselves yet. I think you see it emerging by the late 19th century, though. For example, with writers like George Bernard Shaw, where they do start questioning the empire and do start questioning if what the British are doing is right. But I think it's not really in an advanced stage yet.
Is that a natural outcome, though? Because the Spenglerian argument, as I understand it, I'm certainly no expert on it, but it would seem that there's a certain amount of cyclical inevitability. That sounds like a fair summary of what's going on there. And when you mention someone like George Bernard Shaw as allegedly a Fabian, I haven't looked into it closely. I mean, that sort of is that's the moment at which the camel's nose enters the tent. So you can say that the point at which these empires began to doubt themselves is precisely the point at which a certain ideology spread around that wasn't necessarily imperial. So you can look at the reforms in the Russian Empire and, the trouble they had with revolution. I mean, at least starting with the 1905 one. I think actually it was the late 19th century when, was it Alexander II was assassinated with bombs being thrown into his carriage and the rest. Mm-hmm. So for me, I don't want to get too long-winded with this, but it seems to me that the argument could be made that many of these empires were subverted. Now, the British, absolutely, I will grant you, you have things like, the very beginning of the 19th century, they're moving to block things like slavery and the rest, deploying their fleet off the coast of Africa to screw with the Atlantic slave trade and passing any number of reforms. But really, we can go back to look at the emergence of the self-doubt within empires, if we can dub it that way. We can see that beginning with the idea of the three estates and the common people, the Jacobins, and the French Revolution. So at every place where an argument could be made that we see a clear example of empire doubting itself more recently, there's the question of whether or not some rampant ideology has come through and created this self-doubt. Indeed, in the case of the Roman Empire, we have Christianity emerging. Yes. And well, for my part, the last piece is to go all the way back to the first of your examples, having quoted, moral self-doubt and no moral self-doubt on the part of the Mongols. I'd argue that the Chinese didn't have any moral self-doubt until they started getting their asses kicked so regularly by the West, that they went with their old former example of, having been conquered by nomad horsemen from the Western steppes, they adopted their trousers and the rest. We saw that with the Japanese as well. They adopted Western military techniques, seeing that their own were ineffective. So I'm not sure that that's Spenglerian so much as it is a biological response to being met by a superior group. In the case of someone who makes war on them and forces them to engage with military innovation, right? Yeah, so like the Japanese and the Chinese. The Greeks, I'm not even sure that we can show a sense of doubt. In fact, Hellenism itself, which followed on the heels of Alexander's conquests, and you get things like saying, oh, the great mother, the temple of the great mother of Ephesus, that great mother must in some way be related to our Diana and our Artemis. Our Isis corresponds here, Osiris corresponds here, this Persian aspect corresponds to this. It was in fact, even though the empire was falling apart and you had different generals of Alexander's taking over different areas and creating new dynasties, the mental aspect was to project these what came to be called Hellenistic ideas everywhere and assume them as a universal substrate. So hopefully this will prick you to respond with some defense.
To go from your last point to back, Spengler first distinguishes between Faustian and Magian cultures. So these sort of cyclical things in self-doubt, it mostly applies to Europeans because they are the ones who are capable of doing things like self-doubt and such things. And he would say probably that the Asians and the Chinese have natural despotism and they have a Magian spirit and they wouldn't suffer from the same thing. On the other hand, he also gives the example of the Heavenly Kingdom as one of the cyclical examples of cyclical civilization where imperial dynasties continuously fall in Chinese history. And he used to give the example of the Mongols. The Mongols did, their empire collapsed. They formed the Ming Dynasty in China, and the Ming Dynasty eventually also fell. And the reasons dynasties were overthrown was usually because of decadence, war, famine, but some reason usually emerged and they would be overthrown. And the cultural shifts weren't big in China, to be fair, but they did certainly fall. The Ming Dynasty did certainly fall. So back to your point to the Greeks, how Spengler says the Greeks started their self-doubt is in their cultural perception, in the individualization of culture, like the example of the theater, where the general civilization takes a backseat to the individual. And so he would, for example, say that the fact that Alexander's empire was succeeded by personal interests of his generals would be an example of this societal decay towards self-doubt, because they would pose their own individual interests above that of the general Hellenistic culture. Also, Hellenistic culture wasn't really unchanged by the fact that Alexander conquered the East. They were influenced strongly, for example, by Buddhism, especially in the Greco-Bactrian kingdom and the Seleucids. You raise a number of points. I can't remember all of them right now.
Well, the gist of it is simply that I'm not sure that it's so neat a thing as to say that empire carries within it the seeds of self-doubt and destruction. I mean,
right? Yeah. The foreign ideology thing, right? That's. I think that's part of the process of empire, though. That these ideologies that are doubting of the culture emerge, like communism, like Christianity, like, in a sense, Buddhism was this for the ancient Hindu cultures. Buddhism was this anti-materialist sort of philosophy that went against the older, more militant traditions of the Aryan conquerors that came before.
But arguably Buddhism came out of an Aryan context as well, with Shakyamuni. Shakyamuni being like Sakasake, Scythian Shakyamuni. I mean, it was a different riff on some very similar.
But that would fit perfectly in with Spengler, because he would say that would be logical, because only Faustians are capable of producing that sort of self-doubt. So it would have to be Aryan. Otherwise, it couldn't emerge as a source of self-doubt.
Sure, but is there not a question mark to be placed? And I'm not trying to be willfully difficult, but it is my job to, play the interlocutor. I mean, on the one hand, you could describe an empire as falling based on self-doubt, but in arguably many of these cases, perhaps even all of them, depending on how you wanted to define it, you're actually seeing an empire being forced to change or absorbed, and the rest based on yet another empire.
For example, Buddhism, Christianity, and communism came from a change in ideas from their own people. It's not an external force, it's an internal force. And the reason they can succeed is usually because of a crisis, which is usually caused by a lack of vitality and strength in their own culture. For example, I don't think Tsar Ivan the Terrible would have really suffered from a communist revolution.
No, indeed, but coming at it from the other direction, what are we to say to the pagans whom Charlemagne forced down into the waters of the rivers and said basically, accept your baptism or be slain? And you can look, for example, to the northwest of Europe, where you don't see any of the sort of things that are not much in the way until recently in a socialist variation. You didn't see much going on with acceptance, for example, of the idea that women had to be playing inferior roles, and that there had to be a sense of guilt associated with femininity and the rest. Those more Mediterranean ideas that were more current in that area had only a very late and very limited penetration in places like the northwest of Europe.
Arguably, it never really took hold. There's a famous Dutch female poet who used to, almost like a sort of feminist shrew in the 16th century, who used to write about the horrors of men, and she ran a successful business independently of men, never married.
Yeah, and I remember back in the 90s there was a it obviously would be entirely unremarkable today, but there was a prime minister, or whatever the hell you call the leader of Iceland, who was a single mother, and you have the old tradition of the women wearing rings of keys because they had control over their own, dominion within the house. And, the idea that they didn't have a key to even one thing in the house was grounds for divorce. So, I mean, I don't want to wind too far down that byway, but there are cases in which we see that the cultures don't necessarily fall as a result of it. And yet they were conquered for a time by Christians who came from the south, to the example of Charlemagne. I think there is value in these vast ways of seeing things in terms of
macro versus the micro.
Yes, but in each case, it's like, well, you find out that it's not exactly a triangular peg going into a triangular hole. Maybe it's a square peg that they hammer hard enough and they can make it fit over here, and over there it's got 5 sides or whatever.
Well, one of the things is that, for example, empires. So what you're saying is basically that the people have sort of a Volksgeist, as we would call it in the German conservative tradition, where the nature of a people is sort of innate in them, and it can be suppressed by foreign ideas. For example, the Volkish movement of the 1900s, 1910s, 1920s would argue something like this, that Christianity was a foreign ideology imposed on them that could never conquer them, and that the reassertion of certain ideas later on were simply a return to what was natural to the German people. I think Spengler would probably have agreed with that, but there's a difference. One of the things is that empire destroys its own native culture. So, for example, Rome, the Roman people, the plebs by the end, ended up just with bread and circuses, and that's one of the reasons empire generally doesn't benefit its own people. Is the ones who benefited mostly from the conquest of Rome were the patricians, and eventually they start only looking at the external interests, and the people become neglected, and it's from the people that folk culture comes, and from folk culture later on arises high culture. For example, in the 19th century, a lot of high culture was the repurposing of old myths and sagas. So the fact that empire sort of destroys the culture of the originator conquering people, generally speaking. I mean, for example, the Hellenes had less of this issue, but Rome certainly did. And I think the Americans also certainly suffer from this, that your own native culture has suffered from the fact that you're an empire. The fact that you lack this identity is, yeah.
I was just going to say, I'll grant you in the case of Rome, with the proliferation of, Mithraic cults for soldiers, sodalities and their private rituals, the emergence of the cult of Isis, which we have recorded with Apuleius and the Golden Ass. We do have examples of late Roman imperial decadence is pretty well.
Right? Where the gladiatorial games take over, and it becomes more and more bloody, and it's more and more just to appease the plebs. And it's as if, for example, all American culture were American football today. Becomes blood sports.
But take a look, for example, at the moment that you move from the Republic to the Principate with Octavianus or whatever, Augustus, and Maecenas. And he himself, Maecenas, is a patron for poets like Virgil and Horace. So that's the moment at which, now you could say the empire was still growing at that point. It hadn't sort of collapsed.
Cato the Elder would have called them all degenerates.
I'm sorry?
Cato the Elder would have called them all degenerates.
Cato the Younger even more so, but both the Catos were more or less useless. Certainly the younger one, in my view.
That's a matter of perspective.
But so anyway, yes, the Mos Maiorum has been threatened, and the Romans have turned away from their true ways and become degenerate, and Kaiser himself is an example of this and has to be stabbed to death, and yet Octavianus or Augustus takes his place and forces it. I mean, this is a little more mixed up. I do grant that we see that Rome is famous as an example of a kind of debauchery and degradation, cultural degradation, and certainly highly cosmopolitan, dealing with the elites. Sorry?
Especially by the late empire.
Well, yes.
So the Principate's still not the worst period, right? It's still...
No, because to follow with your thing, there's a room. There's plenty of room for it to grow and expand. There were many conquests that were still waiting to happen that got locked into place. And it had not collapsed under its own weight. And you could argue that there was certainly a great deal of debauchery at the peak of the English Empire, evidenced in things like their hellfire clubs, and there's also the way in which, as a friend of mine observed years ago, and I've mentioned in past streams, that you see the costume of empire associated with sexual fetish. So we have two outfits that are very commonly associated with sexual fetish. One is corsets and garters and stockings, and tightly laced things, in terms of the corset being tied to create the narrow waist and the rest. And that's associated now with all sorts of lingerie and women's clothing. That comes straight out of the 19th century. And you can see sort of the echo of the British Empire there. Another one we have is the idea of riding crops and leather and little officers' caps and the rest that really are like caricatures of mid-20th century Germans.
This rings this very Anglo-Saxon thing to me. I don't recognize this as fetishized in at least in German or Dutch culture.
Maybe it's just an Anglo and an American thing, but there's no shortage of women wearing, for example, corsets, which none of them wear now. They'll call it a bustier or something. It'll be some more common variant of it, but they wear 19th century undergarments, and this is a costume for sexual escapades. Or they wear leather and rubber and all sort of strangeness, and there's military symbolism in it with little caps that look like they could have come off an SS officer, or gas masks and all kinds of strange outfits in the fetish scene, and both are associated with great military empires. And so I bring this up because it suggests to me that they're, in the sense of like a degradation, a cultural degradation, and going off down some strange byway of fetishes, is associated with this sexuality and with two great imperial periods, however brief the second of them might have been.
See, this is sort of outside of my field of knowledge, or
All right.
I don't know anything about this. It's interesting, but it's not really my field of. As for your Caesar, there is a thing called Caesarism in Spengler's philosophy, where Caesarism would be a breaking point in a culture. It could either be the moment where things really start going downhill because it's now necessary for there to be a despot to make sure that things run orderly, whereas before things could run more organically, and there was a more local ability to just organically run things without the necessity of a despot. Or it could be the moment, for example, with Alexander or Napoleon, where there's a revitalization and there's a moment of a quick golden epoch where the culture gets revitalized and gets a new boost. Of course, it's a bit of a subjective point whether you call Napoleon a revitalization of French culture. But in Spengler's writings, he would be considered that. And it can go both ways, in his opinion. It can be the break of winter, or it can be really the moment winter starts.
Fair enough. Well, then, having inserted these little provisos and niggling, bitchy little bits, let's move over to the specific example of the United States, because I feel like you were setting a general picture. And of course, the general picture is the one where it's not going to fit perfectly in all cases because it's a general picture. And so by attacking you on that front, you should be allowed the opportunity to make the specific case that you came here to make, which perhaps will be a tighter one. So can you share with me and our audience how it is you think all of this applies to the United States?
Right. So if my main lens to look at this is through literature, which is what I'm most familiar with of American culture, since I don't really watch many movies, although, through cultural osmosis you get familiar with them. My perspective on America is fed quite a lot through its literature, and in my perception, America had a very rich literary tradition, as I said, focused a lot around this theme of sort of civilizing the uncivilized and settling the wilds, which is I think like you see in Melbourne, you see in London, you see even in Hemingway to some extent. And I think one of the last representatives of sort of, and it's a very masculine culture, right? It's very independent. I think, for example, libertarianism is a philosophy that could only have emerged in the United States because if you are in the wild, it's possible for you to be completely on your own and self-sustaining because you don't have a society and people around you constantly to deal with. So I think libertarianism is a philosophy that's emergent from geographic characteristics of the United States and its general sort of sense of purpose as it had as a nation. And I think that sort of started declining when America became an empire with the Second World War. And that's, I think, what you see back in its literature as well, because these themes disappear and the themes that come into its place are very mercantilist, like Gordon Gekko, and are very consumerist, and they become, for example, I think superhero comics are an example of this commodification of American culture. And I don't think America really produces great culture anymore. No great novels. Films become increasingly derivative. So that's sort of the case, I would say.
Sorry, I had this thing muted. So just as a sort of a test, where we do not see empire at this time, where do we see, in the absence of empire, a still thriving, excellent film, culture, literature, culture, and the rest? You see what I'm after is this really the fact that the United States is imperial and therefore the culture has gone downhill? In order to establish that, can we look to other countries that aren't, where they have the great literary traditions and giants stalk the earth? And at the same time, to be fair, you could come from the other direction and you could say, well, no, it's simply the fact that now the American empire has oozed into everything and destroyed all of it.
That's exactly what I would say. In fact, one of the things that I don't remember who made this point, but it was not a writer replying to Spengler. He said that because Spengler argues that for the cycles to exist, there needs periods of isolation between the winter and the new spring. It needs to, because otherwise the culture doesn't have an organic way to grow. It needs to have its own sort of inspirations. And it's impossible to do that because there is no isolation anymore, because everything is part of the global system. So authentic culture sort of gets eroded away, and there's no real ability to create new, because your headspace will always be at least partially occupied by the global trends, which are mostly set by America, not exclusively, but mostly set by America. So that's one of the reasons I think that the culture doesn't really exist much outside, well, anywhere in the world, except maybe if you go to like some tribes in New Guinea, but then you're not going to get very high culture.
Well, yeah, certainly not by our definitions. So, so what we're seeing here is that we have America coming over the hill, so to speak, of this empire, with the transition to the U.S. becoming the primary naval and military power. You know, after the Brits got screwed out of it basically by Lend-Lease programs and having a huge debt to us, and having to turn over.
You can see in the past, of course, that this also happened on a smaller scale. Like the British influenced the market system of Europe and the economies. A lot of the liberalization of Europe, of course, in the 19th century was inspired on the fact of British predominance. Before then, when French was the dominant power, land power in Europe, French was the lingua franca, for example. So you can usually see that the big powers in the world dominate at least the immediate region they can sort of reach with their culture.
Yeah, I would be interested to hear if there's anything you could say to argue for the idea that it really is these cycles rather than us, let us say, but more recent contemporary man, Europeans in general, looking at the situation that we happen to be in and simply explaining it that way. I mean, obviously there are any number of things that have to do with cycles. I mean, from menstrual cycles to annual cycles of the season, to all sorts of endocrine cycles, to planting and growing cycles, that we look to farmers' almanacs to understand. So I'm certainly not here to claim that things are not cyclical. And there has to. Are
we rationalizing towards our position and using examples from history to nitpick our position? Is what you're trying to say?
Yeah, and I would throw just this last little piece in, is that I very often see this, and it irritates me. This idea that of the survival of the fittest has been somehow it's been popularized, but it's been dumbed down, and it is used to justify whatever the status quo happens to be. So, for example, if something exists, it must be the best thing. It must be the most fit because it's here, which means it must have been the fittest thing and survived and taken down all other comers. When in fact,
the example I usually give against that is, for example, extinction events. For example, after the Permian extinction event, which killed about 90% of all species on the Earth, on the planet, you had all kinds of really weird and inefficiently built animals simply because they had not specialized into their niches yet, so they were in transition stages of evolution, and that existed for several million years. So like a picture at any given moment in time doesn't necessarily reflect, of course, a perennial state. As for the idea of if we're sort of nitpicking history, Niels Bohr once had a saying that, I'm not sure how to translate this into English, but it's something like, if you try to measure an object, you influence the object. So you can never really measure where an electron is, because the moment you try to...
is related to the observer principle,
Yes.
That that's why you need controls and experiments and the rest, because you will influence that which you even gaze upon.
And history is a lot of history is opinion, right? A lot of history is opinion writing, because you're working with incomplete data a lot of the time, and you're always working with a narrative. For example, the worst example of this is, for example, the Zonderweg example, where some German historian of a certain background wrote this conception of history where Germans were from the beginning of their history predestined to commit the Holocaust because that's just their character. Occasions happen where you are just writing history to fit a narrative. I'm not sure if Spengler does that. I'm sure it will always happen to an extent, But I think you can observe most civilizations having a cycle, because every civilization starts and ends and has good and bad times. Whether you call it a cycle in the exact measure of spring and summer and autumn and winter, I'm not sure. Maybe you've got moments where summer turns back into spring, but there is certainly a start and end to all civilizations. And we can observe that there are some commonalities between what starts a culture and what ends a culture. And I think that's fairly empirically derived.
Well, then there's an interesting thing that came up here. I saw it. I can't follow all of the comments because I get lost. I'm not particularly good at multitasking, but I did notice one, and it was something along the lines of the United States. It's not actually an American empire.
Yes, so I knew this would come up. It's the certain group who is. Well,
no, I was actually. We can be more. I don't think it's necessary to be that specific, and that limits us in a certain respect because it applies to more recent history in the West, right? However, I think it's possible to say that a certain amount of cosmopolitanism means that you have a certain number of cities that become important as, commercial entrepôts or whatever, where you have mixed populations, you have trading groups. So, for example, you have Jews as people who have banking technology, let's say banking practices and traditions, I should say. But likewise, the Armenians operate in a similar way, the Parsis, the Chinese in many respects. Wherever you have this
evolution, they sort of fill a niche.
Right, and that niche is generally associated with trade, generally flourishes in a cosmopolitan center. And so to a certain extent, not just limited to Jews as a group, but many others, you see that cosmopolitan elites become internationalist. I mean, you saw it with the Romans. They called the just the normal merchants and the rest, I think they called it mercators or something of that sort, right? Related to merchants and mercantile, right? But the big ones, the huge banking houses, with their little ivory banking tallies and the rest, with their credit and with their similar banking practices used across the empire and beyond. They were called negociatores, right? And so I guess what I'm getting at here is, without having recourse to any specific group, looking at it more generally, because this Spenglerian approach is nothing if not a general view for the universal themes, can we argue that at the moment that it becomes, that whatever culture it is has made the transition to empire, is the moment that it becomes necessarily cosmopolitan, at which point, I mean, it would almost strengthen your argument, because it's just another way of coming at the same question. At the moment it becomes truly cosmopolitan, then how can it even be defined as X original culture at all?
I think the counter argument would be China, which is an empire which is able to do without foreign merchant groups in it. Although maybe that's only.
I was about to say Hong Kong. What's really going on there?
Yeah. Maybe maybe they're in a transition period towards such an empire in its late stages. I think complexity necessarily implies more administration and more managerial elites, which means that as an empire becomes more and more complex, it definitely does create a niche for more administrators, more bankers, and so on.
Well, I want to make sure that point doesn't get lost, because that's a very good one, because there's a certain amount of bureaucracy that is required here, and as soon as the bureaucracy rises up, it's, I often go back to the idea of like a scribal elite, right? My friend Tim used to mention that all the time, with Platon.
It's something that Mencius Moldbug talks about a lot, the revolution of the bourgeoisie over the aristocracy and the monarchies, which happened with liberalism.
And relates that directly to a scribal class or the bureaucracy?
Well, a bourgeois class, a merchant class, yeah. I don't know exactly who came up with this, but there's this YouTuber called Kenneth Brown, and he talks a lot about the tripartite order and perennialism and so on. And the tripartite order, I guess you're familiar, but it's the old
Indo-European division of, that being the smallest set, but you sometimes get more castes or classes, but three being the core.
For example, yeah. and that the merchant class emerges as these three become insufficient to fill certain niches, and with the 19th century and the Industrial Revolution, they sort of overthrew the aristocracy, which would be the warrior caste, which sort of lost its purpose, especially with mechanical warfare. And that's why, and liberalism is an ideology suited to fit them, which is why it's logical that it emerged in a mercantile nation like Britain. It's less logical why it would translate so well to America, except that you are of Anglo stock, because you're a much more landlocked power and you have an actual very strong agricultural base.
Well, it's be careful with calling it a landlocked power, because from some world strategy views, we are like the new Great Britain, the way in which Great Britain was an island nation and stood off the coast, and therefore it was a little bit more difficult to get at them, relative to other continental infighting and wars. We being off across the Atlantic. And we have both the Atlantic and the Pacific coasts. So yeah, it's be careful with
But it's a very big island in that case.
Absolutely.
I guess it also, that's one of the things I did want to go into, but I guess I get to it a bit later. But I think America has several cultures within it, which is why one of the reasons it doesn't really mesh very well. But you were talking about farmers and so on. Interestingly, if you read about Zionism, you read Theodor Herzl's Der Judenstaat. He actually argues that having been a ruthless merchant class for so long has really damaged Jewish culture. And one of the reasons he wanted to reconquer Israel and settle it is so they could be a real people again, with a working class and an elite and a warrior caste, and be a genuine nation. That's his argument in the Judenstaat, which he is actually, of course, basing on a lot of German conservative ideas that were predominant at the time. But even Zionists used to make this case that being a mercantile people is destructive, not just to the nation they inhabit, but also to themselves.
That's an interesting point that dovetails with what I was after when I was mentioning the scribal classes, because it's not entirely the same as the middle class, bourgeoisie, or whatever. It's the idea that you have a certain class of people, and that you see what is originally the keeping of records in the temples. Although it's a little bit different with the Chinese, because there was a religious aspect related to their origin of writing. There nevertheless still was an accounting dimension, and in some respects their religious use of writing beyond the oracle bone stuff, turtle plastrons and ox scapulae, involved the making of contracts or the making of lists and the rest, and burying it in the ground for their ancestors.
That's what most languages start, right? Religion and law.
Yeah, but what I'm after with it is that you have generally there's an accounting, there's an attempt to, so you've got like instance and kind. So you've got a mark that represents a given thing, and that's kind, right? And that gives us categories to some extent. And then there's the tally marks, which allows us to count it, right? And that goes to our clay tablets and our temples. And our temples are very often where money is being minted, and if it's not, it's where it's being stored, and it's where accounts are kept of things. And as soon as you get to, these imperial levels, you've got to field huge armies. You move from a campaigning season that is, that shuts down in the winter because the passes become impassable and, things freeze up and you can't go attacking your soldiers until the weather gets warm again. Once you get to this sort of imperial arrangement, you're moving in different seasons across the empire. In the United States, you see things like having to create time zones. You have to plan ahead logistically with supply lines in order to be able to field your armies. You have to have your war chest set up, planning for the fact that you'll have to pay your soldiers.
Right.
You have all the infrastructure of empire, and it goes back to these temples and their tablets and their accounts, which are not strictly mercantile. Yes, they are, but there's something deeper in it. You could almost argue that there's the religion of the book in that, in the sense that the book is originally a ledger. And so just the last piece is that what you have are scribes who are necessary to make sure that the empire continues to function. And they themselves become a powerful class in their own right. So if you try to get rid, in the case of the Jacobins, of the existing scribal class, all these new revolutionaries who come to power, some devotee of Rousseau, he gets into office and he's like, power to the people. And then he's like, how the fuck do I run this? And we heard similar things about the Bolsheviks when they came to power. They were like, well, this is all great and everything, but now we're in charge. How do we run it? And what stays consistent across that whole period is that scribal class, that, behind the scenes.
Well, I guess you could say that the scribe class is derivative of the priestly class, probably, in the way you're describing it, that it goes from the priestly class.
Yes, it goes directly from cleric to clerk.
But the difference is, of course, that the priestly class has a role in proscribing morality and in sort of regulating the society's mores through social discipline, where the secular law doesn't enter, and it's enforced mostly through social ostracization and so on. And the clerk has no such moral compunction. He's there to serve the state. And if he's there to serve the state, I guess he becomes less and less moral over time and starts serving his own interests more and more. And
let's say the institution rather than the state.
Sure, yeah, because it could be the king. Well, yeah.
And that's what's interesting, because, and I'm trying to come back around to your original idea. Well, wouldn't that give us an interesting thing to look at the point at which it becomes cosmopolitan? Is the point at which the dominant writing class is the clerk or the functionary or the bourgeoisie person, and they are the ones who hold the power, and they do so based on being cosmopolitan and interchangeable, right? If you keep a set of accounts based on one standard on, let's call it the left-hand side of the empire, and over on the right-hand side of the empire, you have an entirely different set of writing standards and the rest, then they're not going to be able to communicate one with the other, and you lose that efficiency, right? You don't want to have a whole bunch of groups of scribes to have to come in and translate your clay tablets. You want one standard tablet or tally stick or scroll across the empire, which means that you get an amoral, bureaucratic writing class that's by necessity cosmopolitan. And
if they take power, then...
At that point, you begin to lose and strip off, back to your example of what was it with the Jews wanting to have a nation of their own, so that they weren't simply this banking and negotiating class, cosmopolitan spread over the rest of the world, but they wanted to bring in soldiers and farmers and statesmen and these other features of, I mean, it's almost like they're in seed form is another way in which the culture can fall apart. To the degree that it becomes imperial, it has to have sets of standards, time zones, exchange rates, and
empire leads to standardization. Yeah, no, sure.
And the rise of that very bureaucratic class that we just talked about has allegiance to the institution itself and is amoral.
Which is, because of its education, the first to start noticing flaws in the system, start criticizing it and undermining it. So yeah, I think these do tie together. Yeah, that empire creates complexity. Complexity creates a class of educated people who start doubting the system and looking out for themselves.
Right, doubting the system, and from the perspective of knowing better. Because I remember my business of traveling around, and I'd come back to the U.S. and I'd be like, none of you people have ever seen anything. Have you actually traveled to these other countries and seen how they think? You're the little ones. You're the ones who don't know anything about anything. And it's very much a leftist attitude.
Which ties into Spengler in an interesting way, because Spengler says one of the first things required for a new civilization to emerge is absolute self-confidence. No doubt in your own morality, no doubt in your own thinking. And I think that's interesting that you see that with, for example, Robespierre was completely without doubt in that liberalism was completely correct, and that everyone was a counter-revolutionary. So that the Bolshevists, and I guess in a way the modern progressives are no different, really. Besides probably accelerated.
Yes, we're seeing that going on. Yeah, no doubt about it out here in the world around us. But now I have been somewhat hopeful that you were going to be more aggressively. Some of it's just a game, some of it's just play. But I had kind of been hopeful that you were going to come more ferociously at the United States to tell us what's wrong with this.
Well, what's wrong with you is, of course, well, that's the hard thing. Do I want to attack the average American for what the American elites do? Because in a sense, I do think you're at least partly guilty. One thing I really dislike is, for example, the American sense of patriotism, when you salute the flag and so on, because it makes you, in a sense, complicit in all these destabilizations in the Middle East and these waves of mass migration and all these aggressive wars you've been waging. I mean, without the American people, these things would be impossible. Financing them, serving in your armies. So I guess in a sense you are complicit in all of the immoralities and I would really prefer if America either found some way to, if I put it nicely, reconstitute itself and retreat from the world, or just collapse. Because without America, I think there would be a revitalization of a lot of things. There would be a lot of wars, of course, because a lot of people would have accounts to settle without the Americans around to stop them from doing so. But I think it would really create, because of this created power vacuum, create a scramble for power, and it would also allow sort of a breather to create new cultures and start sort of thinking, why were we following Hollywood and everything? Why were we watching these stupid Netflix movies about people in capes? Was this really something we wanted to be doing? So I think America is, as a nation, a blight upon the world, really. But
tell us how you really feel.
Yeah. See, you didn't want me to hold back, so there we go. The interesting thing, I think, is that I wrote once for a website called Identity Dixie, which is a Southern website. And I think actually Southerners, interestingly, are the most preserved culture of America. It probably has to do with the fact they were, of course, defeated, conquered, and then kept out of sort of the power centers for a long time.
Yeah, up through the 1950s, early 60s.
And they're, of course, they make up most of the soldiers, but not really. They don't really control power, and they don't have much influence in the culture. Or didn't used to, anyway. Certainly not now anymore. So I think they're still one of the most preserved identities in the United States. And I think the United States has several identities, which sets it sort of against itself as well. But yeah, I think probably America should, in the most positive sense, if Trump had been who he really said he promised to be, because I supported him in 2016, because I had really hoped the Americans would retreat from imperialist politics and stop occupying Germany, destabilizing Libya and Syria, provoking Iran, that sort of thing. Of course he didn't. And I don't know if you are able to reverse course on that. And I think probably you're headed towards collapse.
Well, the only thing that I will certainly own, with great shame, on behalf of my people in the broadest sense, the American people, that is, some of them anyway, is this business of superheroes and capes and spandex pants. Absolutely repulsive and a blight upon all culture and people everywhere. Though I suppose, the entire world gets what it deserves if it accepts it. That I will own. As for the rest, I'm not sure. I'm not here to defend Trump. I'll be happy where I'm able and honestly able to defend the United States. But to come to the business of Trump, since you brought it up, do you somehow see that the United States has become more imperial in its activities since his appearance?
Not strictly in its open aggression, but its support for example, Israel has really escalated, and that will always inevitably correlate with more conflict in the Middle East. For example, this business of them signing a peace treaty, that's a bit of a farce. I don't think many people in the Arab world really agree with their government signing these treaties. I think it's a meaningless gesture, and as long as the United States keeps supporting Israel, you're going to keep causing conflict in that region, which is bad for us in Europe because it causes refugees to come over here.
Well, let's back up. There are a couple points there. One is the idea that the people don't agree. When have the people in that region ever, in large part, agreed with what their rulers did? Are you not projecting and assuming that they're a democratic yeomen who are ready to complete their educations and do their civic duty and attend the schools and pay their dues? No, they have always been told what to do by people. You can argue perhaps that Israel is at least closer to a democracy, but that region, I'm not taking a position, I'm just saying that one could, compared to Yemen, say that Israel, for example, is closer to a democracy.
Well, I'm not a Democrat, so.
Sure. The issue there is, first off, why even use a democracy and whether or not the people's voice is being respected in that region is a standard to judge anything they do. The second point is just because we should fight a little bit, just because we should fight a little bit for the viewers. There have been
gloves or.
There have been wars in the Middle East since time immemorial, and even ones fostered in large part by the United States and others in Europe. In some cases, Britain and France certainly shouldn't be left out of this mess, and yet it never caused waves of refugees. So, I would argue that it's not so much American imperialist activity that is causing waves of refugees. I mean, in fact, there's a great book that I'm reading called Weapons of Mass Migration, which talks all about how relatively powerless states, in comparison to much bigger, powers, use migration intentionally in order to create all kinds of problems and to negotiate and get, to put pressure on people to get what they want.
Yeah.
So
this was very obvious with the Marrakesh Pact, for example, with how they voted on it within the UN and so on.
So, I mean, basically, you're saying if the United States, because again, not to wind down too far down a byway, the United States were to disappear, suddenly things would there'd be fighting. You granted, as that
things would get interesting at least.
Yes, but I kind of wonder what other great cultures are out there. I mean, everybody is watching these superhero
I think
movies.
For Europe, it would be a realization of, we don't have America as sort of the shield. We have to really start self-asserting again. The bad thing would be if that would happen under a liberal umbrella, but even the current EU would probably move towards a more autarkic and more nationalist culture at that point, because they'd have to. I would prefer, of course, that we overthrow their regimes then, but that's another story. I think the disappearance of America would reassert the balance of things more towards how it was in the 19th century. And I think it would sort of set civilization back on the course it was in the 1900s, where we'll just start doing useful things again, like colonizing the stars and so on, rather than whining about race, because this race discussion is a very American thing as well, for example.
This socialism and communism emerged in Europe. And while we certainly have quite serious problems with it of our own in the United States, it seems that there are many, many more true believers in that respect in Europe. Now, I mean, I've heard from different people in different nations who take a different position. So there are still plenty of, right-wing or reactionary or monarchists or whatever. However, there seem to be lots and lots of card-carrying, true believer socialists, and perhaps even more in Europe. And so, if the United States were just going to disappear suddenly, it would be, the banners would begin to flutter, and men would come out in polished armor, and women would swoon again, and we would, and Richard Spencer would run to the front of the crowd, and he would talk about telos. And suddenly the Dutch space program would go rocketing, up into the sky.
No, of course it wouldn't be that easy. It would take several centuries for things to really settle down again. But it would create a more multipolar world. It would create, for example, for Europe, more of a purpose. It would really start forming us into more of an independent power bloc, because right now we're just slaves to America.
No, you're also you're pinched between the former USSR, Russia, and the United States. You've been caught in that vice for quite some time, and that's another thing that I often wonder about. It's always America, 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 the U.S. And I will grant you there are any number of things that we have been involved in that I think we shouldn't have been. America. However, the other side of the jaws of that vice, Russia is.
Sure, Russia is also imperialistic.
Yes, and I mean it's literally. I mean, on one side over here you have the Atlantic, and now the U.S. and is trying to peel off the U.K. to reassert some sort of Anglosphere aspects, and over on the other side you've got Russia quietly waiting, and of course China is doing everything in its power in the United States to spread the story that it's Trump and Putin are going to do something, because we've now got three power groups: China, Russia, and the United States, and the biggest risk for China is that Russia and the United States begin to cooperate, particularly after China has made so many inroads into the EU. And so I'll grant
Russia
you
is also making some, because we are energy dependent on it. I think the main difference is that Putin wants me to become Orthodox, whereas the United States wants my child to become transsexual. So I'd rather take Putin.
Officially, yes, that's the current Putin position, right? But as long as we're going to look at this as a historical arc, you cannot look at the role that the United States has played in Europe without looking at Russia or the former Soviet Union as well, because basically Europe is in its current situation in large part as a result of a pact between FDR and Stalin.
Yeah.
And both countries were involved in carving it up. Both countries
were. If it wasn't for you, we'd have beaten them.
Well, yes, and I think that's a fair assertion. Without the trucks and the equipment and the food and the uniforms and the rifles and the rest, probably they would have been taken care of. But then again, without the Germans having set up those revolutionary parties in order to create trouble behind the lines for the Tsar, then maybe we wouldn't have had the problem in the first place.
Right, but maybe if the Anglos didn't betray their allies in 1917 and 1945, we wouldn't have that problem either.
Well, I mean, if you want to call the Brits the Anglos, I'm happy to blame everything on them. Perfectly happy.
But see, the Brits, the Brits to me are sort of your dad, and I blame the dad more for poor parenting than anything else.
All right. Well, now I am trying not to jump straight into the fray, just shouting "America, America, America." But if
what I find interesting, well, if I completely deviate, why do you support America in that way? Do you think? Because I mean, you're obviously a political dissident. You realize that your elites aren't really acting in your interest or in the interest of your people. The people you interact with who are really part of your same culture and so on. Why would you defend America?
Well, because I live here, and it's not all bad.
It's mostly bad.
Well, if in your view,
McDonald's is a crime against humanity.
I wouldn't argue there. I dislike McDonald's, but these things have spread everywhere, and they're not just. It's like the old thing. They're not just American. I had started to say it's like the old thing with the vampire. The vampire doesn't come into your house unless you invite him in. Now, or the old thing of the traitor. Within the city walls, who opens the gates for invaders.
Sure. In your case, though, you kind of flattened us with bombs and then said, "Do you want some money?" And then you have to accept these cultural things with it as well, and these business deals.
Well, let's be fair. Did we really flatten Holland with bombs, or the Netherlands?
Yeah. More Dutch people died from British and American bombs than from Germans. Of course, more Dutch died if you include Jewish people being deported, but otherwise civilian deaths were much higher from American and British bombing.
Well, now we were bombing German or German allied troops, so I mean, yes,
industry too, and you weren't very accurate.
Well, it was the beginning of strategic bombing. What can you say about that? No one was accurate. If you want to talk about inaccuracies, sending the whichever one that was the automatically piloted was it the V2?
V1s, V2s?
V2's probably one over the other. The people who know more about World War II would be able to say. I mean, you want to talk about inaccuracy. So, yeah, sorry about that, Holland. The Netherlands, I should say properly. The beautiful areas there. I'm sorry to see bombs fall on any of it.
My city was completely flattened, although that was German bombs mostly.
Yeah.
It wasn't only German bombs.
But the main point being there, you have to let these people in to a certain extent, and they've done it across the world. I mean, one of the things in the last 10 years or so, I was doing a lot of traveling with consulting work, and we found that there's a fucking Starbucks everywhere. There's McDonald's everywhere. I mean, we didn't force our way into Russia with them. People realized that there was plenty of money to be made. And so it's the elites in all of these countries, and the elites themselves are this cosmopolitan class that we've discussed. And again, there's no need to narrow it down strictly to Jews. If you go to India, you'll find that the Parsis are doing that shit all over the place. Or look at Chinese merchants in Singapore. And you have a famous old quote of Thomas Jefferson's about the merchant, not having a country but always being after money. So, I mean, is it really our fault that everyone else is susceptible to the same tawdry shit that we're selling?
I think that's what I said. I think one of the faults of the American people is that you didn't really fight hard against it. Like, at least the White Russians and in Germany and in Hungary, there were counter-revolutionaries. And you kind of, with FDR, there was a little bit of intellectual resistance with people like Mencken and Father Colin, but it didn't really fight back very hard against this sort of bureaucratized takeover.
Well, we're arguably, at least the position can be argued. I won't say it's right or wrong, and I'll wait about another 45 days before I update my opinion and share it. But arguably, a fight is still going on. I'm sure you could come from the other direction and say that no, it's not really happening, or it doesn't matter if it did. It's all meaningless because it's all already been written. But I think that the case could at least be reasonably made that the U.S. is one of the least socialist countries out there. And
I disagree.
What country?
Your population is probably the most socialist, infected with progressivism at this point. In certain age brackets, under 25s, under 30s, probably the worst affected.
And do you think there's... Is there any
Sorry.
government out there that you would say is less socialist than the U.S. one?
China, Russia. But for example, one other phenomenon is that you said Europe is very progressive. Yeah, but the thing is, since we were progressive before you and we've been at it for longer, you also see a counter reaction forming that's stronger. So when you see, for example, you see trends here that young people are moving more towards the right. Granted, it's the populist right. It's not really hardline nationalism, although you see some moving towards that as well. But you see a counter reaction because we've had the Netherlands especially, we've had gay marriage for 45 years. We've had legalized drugs, legalized abortion. And a lot of people are now realizing like, well, this is actually not great for society. And we've tried this experiment, let's turn it back. And I think in America, because it's supposedly stayed conservative for, well, at least not Bush, I guess, at least on the surface, right? You have this still fervent desire to attempt this experiment, and I think it's very pervasive among the younger generations in America.
Yeah, well, we'll see. As someone just pointed out in the chat, we still have our firearms, at least in some of the states. And,
I can get guns. It's not that big a deal. I used to have a gun license. I stopped because it's just not a good idea to have because of
Yeah, well,
publicity reasons and so on.
Right-wing thinking, combined with firearms, just gives everybody a big opportunity to shit all over you. I'm sorry, I should have phrased that more diplomatically. But yeah, they'll come in and screw you and smear you in that respect. But now, would you say that the Netherlands is turning around from its previous position? You had mentioned things like legalization of drugs and gay marriage. Another one you could throw in is prostitution and the rest. I remember probably over the last 10 or 15 years, I heard things about, the Dutch taking increasingly more of a negative attitude towards tourists doing drugs. I think psychedelics and mushrooms were removed.
At this point, the red light districts and it are mostly restricted to just Amsterdam with some small exceptions, where it used to be very pervasive. So prostitution has downscaled a lot. And drugs are unfortunately still pervasive, but there's less and less vendor locations, so they've been restricting those as well. Generally, I think at this point, culturally, the Netherlands is compared to its neighbors, compared to Sweden, compared to Germany, compared to the UK, compared to France, we're culturally a lot more right-wing. It's very acceptable here, for example, to say that Moroccans are just all criminals. It's very acceptable to criticize Islam.
I think there might be something with Dutch culture there, though, because I've noticed that, the English, as I've talked about in a recent stream, they like to be polite and they'll add a, blah, 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 isn't it? or
Yeah,
blah, 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 blah. Don't you think? Yeah. And I remember once I had said something, I think it was about Unilever. I can't remember what it was, but I was having a drink with a number of Dutch people when I was in Leiden for a conference. And one of these academics was standing there, and I just misremembered. I was wrong. And I had misremembered something about the corporate history. I was trying to remember what the Dutch East India Company had eventually become. And the latest versions of it that had survived to the present day. And I made some remark about it, and I was wrong because I misremembered it. And the guy was just flat out, no.
Yeah.
The Dutch are very, very happy to tell you directly to your face.
For example, someone asks you, like, did you get a new haircut? And so, yes, well, it doesn't look good on you. That's what a Dutch normal reaction is like, right?
And so I'm not sure if that's right wing. I think it's just a culture of saying it.
Right, but it translates into more right-wing general culture, because if you can say things more directly, you're going to be more honest about things, right? So it is just, I've never had an event where if I talked about allochtonen, Moroccan specifically, with another Dutchman, mostly regardless of class, except the really wealthy city-dwelling elites, you can say, well, Moroccans are all thieves, aren't they? And they'll be like, yeah, sure. It's a very normal thing.
Yeah, will they do it on television?
Some will. The right wing provocateur types will, right? But in polite company, it's still not that acceptable. But generally speaking to people on the street, yeah, it's normal. It is a question of being more direct.
But you feel ultimately that this is something that has been forced upon the rest of the world by the United States, and you would like the evil empire to disappear.
Not just the United States, like I said, the British are your parents, and they did a bad job raising you. So it's really at first it's British being irresponsible with a sort of Germanic sense of independence and freedom, and forming that into a really mercantile ideology of liberalism, and then Americans taking that and running with it even further and really running it into the ground, and then bringing that back to the rest of the world.
Well, then let's perhaps approach it from this direction. Because we've gone down all these wonderful intellectual byways, wonderful to one extent or another. If you were emperor of the universe, if it were Emperor Faust, and I can't think of a better definition of a Faustian man, what would be the first thing that you would undertake in order to deal with these upstart British irresponsible parents and their drooling, imbecilic American offspring who have done so much to hurt the world?
I'm completely the wrong person to ask that, because I'm a very transhumanist kind of guy, and I just kind of say, well, humanity is doomed anyway to be replaced by AI and other more advanced consciousnesses. So really, it doesn't because you don't want to give me a position of power like that. It's I just accelerate techno dystopia in many ways to be just over with the pain of it all, I guess.
So you believe that computers will possess consciousness?
Yes, I think humanity is a first step into real consciousness, and that I believe in the coherence theory of quantum physics, where the universe is cyclical, where the Big Bang was just the birth of this universe from a higher dimension. This is multiverse theory. You can read Roger Penrose's quantum physics on this. And it eventually moves it towards coherence, and you sort of develop a supreme consciousness that in some senses would be equal to God, and humans are just a step in this eons long process. And
well, wait a minute, the supreme consciousness of which all these other instances of consciousness are a part, if I follow you correctly?
It's the process of evolution. The entire universe would be conscious. It's too complex to explain in this. It's a quantum physics.
But it'll be a machine?
At that point, it would be the entire universe.
But I mean, you could call that mysticism as well. If you're going to say that each and every constituent part of the universe becomes conscious ultimately in a whole. If you
want my perspective on this, I have a video on my channel. It's called The Discussion of Materialism versus Spiritualism, where I talk to a fellow Dutch guy who's an almost convert to Islam, where he's a defender of the spiritual side of things. And I'm the hardline materialist, and we kind of talk about this view towards movement towards God and spiritualism and so on. But anyways, you don't want to be giving me supreme power, because I'm only doing this sort of fighting reactionary sort of thing against modernity to kill the time until we're all replaced by AI anyway.
So there's a bright sunshiny day just over the horizon, and you, Faust, you see it.
No, it's dystopian and dark and really depressing.
Is it a cube floating in space?
No, it's just what is. There's no purpose. It's just how things are. But yeah, like I said, it's.
Do you have like
an entire different stream to talk about that.
You have a Grunwald paintings, like, you know, on posters on your wall of a Christ with mottled flesh and thorns stuck into the side. You're a cheery bunch, you Dutch. A cheery bunch.
Germans are worse. Real like Gothic German culture. Preußentum.
Well, it seems, transhumanism.
We're kind of derailed completely from.
Yeah, transhuman, and it's my own fault. I'm a poor host. I certainly wouldn't put it on my guest. You're a friendly guest trying to make your point, even though you do want my country to be.
Blaming Americans for everything, sure.
Yeah. Okay. Well then.
Do you want to take maybe some questions from the chat?
Yeah. If there are any questions, people put an @Semiagog on them so I can see what's there, and we'll try to. Well, here's one. I'm not sure if this relates. This is from Vidatus of Lusitania. Ask Faust's opinion on Femke Halsema, the mayor of Amsterdam. How do you pronounce that?
Femke Halsema.
Femke Halsema, the mayor of Amsterdam.
Yeah. Well, she's such a boring person. There isn't much to say. She's just a standard woman who bought into leftist ideas, and she serves all the corrupt agendas of the elite. I mean, what's there really to say, right?
Well, there you have it, ladies and gentlemen, from a Dutchman.
I mean, Amsterdam. We should sink Amsterdam off into the. These days, it's called the Leidstermeer, but it used to be the IJsselmeer in the Zuiderzee. We just sink it, do it all over again, because it's lost. It's completely lost. Well,
I see that it's not just the United States that you've become disgusted with. Okay,
I'm very partisan on these things. War with France is on the agenda as well. Reconquering Belgium, absolutely.
Well, I mean, you guys are so fighting in such a committed sense to recapture land from the sea. Yeah.
Oh yeah, yeah. There's an actual Dutch hydraulic engineer who proposed that we polder in the entire North Sea, and he actually sketched out the necessary engineering and everything.
Oh, I saw actually. There's a whole business of creating dams between Britain and a number of other places just to lock out a whole huge new block of land.
Yeah,
that would be interesting indeed. Okay, well, I've got a few more questions here. Let me jump to another one. Let me see. I saw one from Woes, which should be okay. So, how much cheese do you consume, Faust, daily? And is it above or below the Dutch average? And I would add to that, what type of cheese? And for example, is it Gouda? Gouda? However the hell you say that.
Gouda. With a hard
Gouda, like, hoe gaat het met jou? Hoe gaat het met u? Gouda.
Oh, it's not bad. I've heard a lot worse Dutch, actually. I eat about half a kilo of cheese a day, I guess. That would be about 2 pounds. And it's a mix of several. I personally like nettle cheese, and we've got one which has these spices in it. But yeah, Gouda's fine as well, right? Fine.
Dude, once again, how many pounds?
2 pounds of cheese, about.
2 pounds of cheese daily.
I must point out at this point that by American measurements, I am 6'5" and about 320 pounds. So.
6'5".
Yes.
Sweet baby Jesus, they make you big over there.
No, I'm Dutch average.
Oh God, yeah. I remember standing in a McDonald's at 1 a.m. in Amsterdam, surrounded by women who are 6'3", and I was like, Jesus Christ, man! I'm 6 feet tall, which I think of as in the U.S. that's medium, or the bottom end of tall, right? And I got to Holland, and I was like, what the fuck? Okay, so yeah,
apparently people But we sometimes, like some say the Dinaric Alps has taller people, some put us at the lead, but we're at least one or second place in terms of tallest people.
And have you eaten that much cheese since you were a lad? As long as you can remember?
But I'd certainly eat like 100 or 200 grams a day normally, yeah.
So would you say that for example, nationalists who want to raise a tall, strong, long-boned children, would you say that just being sure to feed their children
dairy is one of the main reasons we are so big, yeah.
No, I agree with that.
Are sexually selecting for height and have been for about a century.
Because the longer legs work on the bicycles.
I haven't heard that theory one before, but
it may well be.
The general joke that the Germans say about it is that we grow so tall to survive the flood.
I can see that. Okay, well, that from Millennial Woes. Ladies and gentlemen, Faust consumes approximately 2 pounds of cheese daily, and I don't blame him, actually. If I could, I would live in a cheese castle. Let's see here. God's own prototype, Semiagog. If Faust could be any other ethnic nationality, which would it be and why?
German.
So just another. So what kind of German? The Germans north and west of
Russian,
you?
Probably.
Oh,
I'm half German, actually, but that's why I have the last name Lancer, which is a German name. I'm generally a Germanophile when it comes to culture and international politics, because in the Dutch nationalist movement, it's very common to be either a separatist where you want to unite with Belgium and form the independent Deutschland, or to form a federated sort of Holy Roman Empire sort of thing with Germany, because we used to be part of the Holy Roman Empire. So it's independentist or Germanicist most of the time, and I'm more of the Germanicist sort of school.
I like the idea of you guys flooding everything like you did in the 17th century and just telling the rest of the world to fuck off and driving everyone out. And then, in addition to flooding everything else, maybe you could pump the water, since you're such good hydro engineers, you could pump the seawater into the rest of Europe and thereby acquire that land, create a bridge, and take over Britain. I think.
Oh, that's on the plan. Oh, no, Britain's not going to. If we become strong enough, Britain's not going to have a good time. Fourth Channel War coming up.
Or orange flags, back to the days of William the Silent.
Oh, I have a Prince of Vlag over there on my wall. Yeah, the nationalists usually use the orange, oranje banje bleu rather than the red one, because we consider that to be the modern flag and the republic and so on. That's the orange flag.
All right. Well, then let me move on to woes again. Is there a black market in illegal cheese in the Netherlands?
Now we would never go so far as to declare any cheese to be illegal, except cheddar maybe.
Okay, so you don't have the U.S. thing of like all the cheese needing to be pasteurized. You're civilized in the same sense like the French are. You still have
no, you can get camembert and everything here. Yeah.
Well, we can get it here, but it's pasteurized and shitty. Yeah.
We can also eat Kinder eggs.
What are the little chocolate, the shitty chocolate eggs?
Yeah.
Yeah.
We also don't make our booze out of corn. You weirdos.
Well, it's just cheap, and now I don't recommend it. Now you try some corn whiskey, you might like it.
I've tried bourbon; it's disgusting. Scotch and especially Irish whiskey is better.
Well, I like it with a bit of peat. I like a peaty
Scotch
smoked islay style. Yeah. And apparently there are very good Irish whiskeys. We don't get many of them. Everyone's like, Jameson's great. I'm like,
Jameson's one of the cheaper ones.
Yeah, and that's that's what we end up with. So, Okay, this one from Millennial Woes. Man, Woes is in the house. Apparently, he's coming after you, man. What do you think about the French?
What don't I think about the French? Well, in the same way that Britain poisoned the world through America with their version of liberalism, France kind of poisoned continental Europe with their version, with the Napoleonic law code and so on, and the metric system, so on.
That's repulsive. Yeah.
I don't actually oppose the metric system. It's a fairly efficient system. I mean, it's cute how you still use feet and everything like it's the 12th century, but it's not.
No, the idea. Allow me to let you in on the reality of why it matters. Measurements that are human like the span or the cubit, right, or the foot, or the meter being a stride or a step, which the yard, I should say, the meter being a ripoff of it. All of these things come, or an inch, right, a segment of the thumb, is that it's designed for human beings. It's at their scale. Pardon?
But see, the thing is, we live in an industrial society where the human scale isn't efficient enough to deal with the necessities of our logistics and economy and so on.
Nonsense. If a door isn't the right size for a person to walk through it, it's the wrong size door.
Yeah, but that's a door. What about accounting?
But if you want to go in terms of what makes sense, then base 12 makes far, 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 far more sense, being much richer in factors than base 10. So
decimal is much easier to divide, especially when you get to larger numbers. Yes.
No, it's not easier to divide. How can it be? You can divide 10 by, of course, 1 and 10.
How do you divide into?
Well, allow me to finish. You got 1 and 10, and then you've got 2 and 5. It's got 4 factors. Base 12, at base 12, you can divide by 1, 12, 2, 3, 4, and 6. It's got 6 factors. And that's precisely why an eminently practical people, the Romans, used base 10, actually base 5. Everybody calls it base 10, but if you look at Roman numerals and how they break out, it's actually base 5. 5 being the shape of the hand, the V, right? But their abaci employed base 12 for the fractions, which made it much, and that's why we have a gross and a dozen. I mean, there are reasons. That's why we break up our time scale into 24 hours, which is 2 groups of 12, which is why we divide the sky, even in the metric system, by 360. The only reason
that survived is because it was actually workable with I mean, that's why we have Schikkeljaar, what do you call it in English, where you have a year with an extra day, because that system isn't quite perfect. But for whole numbers, maybe it works. But like if you go into, for example, micrometers, these sorts of things, a base 10 system is just much easier.
Piffle. All right. Well, I'm certainly no master mathematician. We started with your thoughts on the French.
Right. Well, I guess if they return to monarchy, maybe we can talk.
Very well. Let that be a warning to you. Someone's 6'5" and eats 2 pounds of cheese a day. Has stated unequivocally that if the French don't move around to monarchy, then they'll have him to deal with. A millennial woes really seems to want to.
We're doing the millennial woes after show now.
Well, we've got a little bit of time left, and I don't see any other questions as yet. So, there's something from Otto Poll, Jonathan Poll, that I didn't see. Maybe I missed it. There we are. Okay, so more questions have come. So we'll quickly do the millennial woes. I'm sorry, folks, to be wandering. Faust, do you believe the Dutch are superior to other European ethnic groups?
Yeah, sure, of course. If you don't believe that, like one thing I can respect about Americans is them believing they can do no wrong. I think everyone should believe they can do no wrong and that they're in the absolute right. Because if you start doubting yourself, you can never get anything done.
Okay, so essentially, there's not a great deal of moral consistency in your position.
Now you're wrong, but it's right that you don't think you're wrong.
Okay, this from Jonathan Poll. It's a question for me. Should I? Okay, I'll answer this quickly. Sebiagog was attempting to keep the East Indies after World War II a mistake. Who are you talking about? Like the Dutch and Java or wherever?
I think.
Oh, I see. Yes, this is a question for you. Yes.
My grandfather served in the Knil, and he was captured by the Japanese and was in a concentration camp. I generally think colonialism was a bit of a mistake because it led to a lot of the arguments for migration we have today. If we were going to do it, we should have done it like the Americans have done it and made sure the natives weren't a threat anymore, to put it euphemistically. So after World War II, trying to keep it wasn't possible because by that point the American empire was dominant, and every time we tried to do something, for example, we won that war, but it was under pressure from the United Nations and the Americans that we had to give up the colonies anyway. So It wasn't really possible for us to do that anyway.
I'm not familiar with that. And I don't want to get way off on it since we're taking questions, but is there any brief way to summarize what the reasoning was on the part of the UN and the rest for saying that the Dutch had to give up their colonies abroad?
Because they wanted decolonization in general. Eventually the French and the British and everyone had to give up their colonies because it was American standard policy at the time to promote independent movements. Now, to be more cynical about it, this probably had a lot to do with them, with the Americans wanting to be able to exploit them for their own interests. And they are a more subtle form of colonialism, which is called trade deals.
Well, there it is. The true levers of power. Thank you for that, sir. So this from Count Elmsley. Faust, do you actually welcome the forthcoming AI singularity or just see it as inevitable?
I see it as inevitable because there's a video. I have a video on my channel on why I think Ted Kaczynski. He made a lot of good observations, but I think that in the long run, it's pretty much inevitable that we move towards a technological dystopia simply because that's the nature of both humanity and of the general nature of the universe towards increasing complexity. So it's not something I really look forward to because it's not going to be pleasant transition period. A lot of people going to.
Wait a minute, more and more complexity. Aren't we going towards a singularity?
Yeah. So
and the singularity is more complex.
Yes. Again, as I said, just watch the longer videos I have on this.
Okay.
But the general trend of the universe is to become more and more complex. For example, how the planets formed and so on. The most complex planet Earth allows the most complex life and has the most complex tectonics and so on. And well, one of the things with Kaczynski is that a general societal reset is impossible because every time there's a civilizational reset, so there's a cycle. For example, with the Bronze Age collapse, we didn't return all the way to the Neolithic. When the Roman Empire fell, we didn't return to the Bronze Age. Every time a civilization collapses, it leaves things behind, it leaves technology behind. And to just try and convince people into a rational way, if we're going to stop using technology, it's never going to happen. So there's a lot of reasons why I think that's pretty much inevitable, why AI will eventually emerge, or some other form of consciousness that's superior to our own, could be biological. And no, I don't welcome it, but I do think it's inevitable.
Fair enough. All right. Kathleen Batavian observes Faust is a non-typical Dutchman. Most are pro-Anglo, anti-German French.
No, depends. There's some who are, but in the nationalist movement, it tends to be more pro-German. It's really, for example, the division in the 19th century, or with the French Revolution, you had the pro-French and the pro-British, and both of these were liberal. And then you had the pro-Germans, which were the Orangists and were the more conservative side. So there's always been this division in Dutch society of the Francophones, the Anglophiles, and the Germanophiles.
All right. Well, as long as we're not boring the hell out of you, since we have a Dutch person here, it seems that people in the comment section just want to ask your thoughts on things. One of them is, what is the Dutch people's approach to the Corona-chan? The person observes this is Variatus of Lusitania. It says, I heard most places don't enforce masks and people are less hypochondriac than in other countries.
He's from Lusitania, you say?
Well, it says Variatus of Lusitania, so maybe someone who's Portuguese, maybe someone...
Se em casa és português, eu também falo português, bom dia. I speak Portuguese, but we've been very lax with it. Like we officially have like mask, at least in public transportation, you have to wear a mask and the 1.5 meter distance and so on. But I've not seen basically anyone observing it, and even the government is kind of like, we have to input some laws, we have to do something, but it's it's very light compared to, like, I drove through Belgium a couple of weeks ago, and there it's mandatory to wear masks wherever you go into public places, and they enforce it, and people get fines and so on. Now, gatherings in people's homes have had people being fined, but most of the time it's not been very impressive. We don't seem to care very much about it.
Okay, well, thank you. And I'm happy to hear that the Dutch continue to be fairly sensible in some important respects. Prism, hello, sir. Prism asks, does Faust accept the guilt for New Netherlands and New Amsterdam? which is now New York and a source of gangrene in the body politic. I mean, you guys were the big innovators with the Dutch East India Company, rapidly imitated by the English, and perhaps that's where all the trouble started. So, are you willing to own up?
We also developed the stock market,
and coffee shops. You know, it had quite a bit to do with that as well. Yeah. So, I mean, aren't we really looking at a situation where the Dutch have been quietly moving behind the scenes? I mean, Roosevelt, for fuck's sake.
Roosevelt, yeah. But you've got Teddy Roosevelt and you've got Franklin Roosevelt, so they kind of balance each other out a bit, right?
Perhaps I'll allow you that dodge, but you talked, for example, about saluting the American flag and everything, which is a terrible pastime. It turns out the American flag is nothing but a British East India Company flag that they modified very slightly. So they're actually saluting the British East India Company, slightly modified, and that in its turn was based on attempting to imitate the Dutch. Now, we could go back a little bit further to the Portuguese and the Spanish, but they didn't really do it quite the same way as the Northwestern Europeans did. No. So I mean, really, from a certain perspective, the Dutch themselves are responsible for this fucking mess, are they not? Own it.
I'd say that if we were the ones who had been running it, things would have been done properly. It's the fact that the Anglos and the Americans you took our idea and you ruined it.
All right.
But yeah, no, I mean, it's like I said, the British liberalism, of course, comes from this sort of Germanic instinct towards. I mean, the earliest parliament was in Iceland in the 9th century, right, outside of Italy, of course, and there was the old things and so on. So the Germanic instinct is always to be fairly independent, fairly self-assertive, and that's where liberalism, in a sense, comes from. But it was magnified by the fact that they were safe on their little island and became mercantilist, and it really exploded from there. So nothing is ever, of course, emerges from a vacuum. But,
so basically, ladies and gentlemen, it sounds as though Faust is perfectly. How do you say "we didn't do nothing" in Dutch?
We hebben niets fout gedaan.
Yeah, there you go. Dindu. He's claiming Dindu for the Dutch. Okay. Good God, Woes is, man, you must have pissed off Woes.
We're old friends. So you thought we were arguing the other day, but I've known Woes for several years at this point. I gave him a tour through the Netherlands once. Unfortunately, he deleted those videos where we went through all the worst areas with the most migrants, and that was fun.
Man, these back catalogs of people's content that have been, pulled down from places like YouTube, the damage that has been done for posterity, all that documentary stuff, all that was captured is now. Okay. Kathleen Batavian. I guess Batavian. That's a Dutch name, isn't it?
Batavian. Yeah, it's an old tribe.
How can Faust be pro-German when Greater Netherlands, Dietland is obviously superior?
Dietland within the Holy Roman Empire is my position.
Okay. Well, see.
Revive the Bourgondische Krijts.
What he said. Okay, so Woe says, does Dutch society have a class structure?
Not like the English do. I think about 70 to 80% of Dutch people qualify as being in the middle class. There certainly is a phenomenon of course, managerial elites who isolate themselves and occupy most of the positions of power, but there isn't this class awareness thing very much. Because that has to do with the stubbornness thing. No one, like 1 in 8 Dutch people are self-employed. We have a lot of companies started every year. Dutch people always think they know better than everyone else. So someone telling them what to do, they would be like, "Who are you to tell me what to do? I'll do it better myself. Go away." So
and
we wouldn't accept class.
Why do you think that is in terms of its historical origins? I mean, you could say, for example, that the Americans have had their characters shaped to a certain extent by frontiers, right? As you said at the outset, and so that would explain, along with things like you pointed to the things and the rest, and a certain sort of yeoman attitude of free men.
I think it has
cooperating. Why the Dutch?
I think it has a bit to do with maybe the sea culture and the fact we were a marsh, where everyone had their own little ships and so on. See, there's this theory in Dutch society called the Polder model, which would actually argue that Dutch would be very agreeable because we had to all work together to keep the dikes up and to keep the water out. And that's sort of one of the big theories of our political model. But you don't see that in Dutch people because we're quite disagreeable. So that doesn't seem to ring very true to me. So I think it has more to do with this sort of adventurous spirit, because with being a naval power, we just kind of, if things didn't suit us in the Netherlands, we'd go, I don't know, raid England or trade with the Norse or something like that. Go fishing in the North Sea. I think maybe something like that had to do with it.
Yeah, well, yes. And maybe it's because you've lived in a strange area there on the coast that nobody wanted. Or maybe it's just because you're all so tall and, I mean,
you're asking me to just basically produce a sociological explanation on the fly, and I'm sorry, I don't have that.
No problem. You were perfectly willing to explain how, transhumanism was going to work out. But okay, I'm just fucking around. Kathleen Batavian says, why would we as Dutch nationalists support the Orange Dynasty and Germans? We are much closer to the Anglos.
Genetically, that's very dependent on which province we're talking about. Genetically, the Hollanders are a bit close to the Anglos, and in the interior, they're a lot closer to the Germans. Frisians are Frisians, of course. So that doesn't hold quite true genetically. Culturally, also doesn't hold true. But the thing is, there's sort of moments in history, like in the 19th century, we were very close to Germany culturally, economically, because at that point, German industry was our bread and butter, because we were just the port of Germany. In the 17th century, we were much closely tied to the Anglos, because Germany didn't have a much developed economy yet, and our trade was very dependent on trading with the Anglos, which eventually the Anglos stole from us by having
Albion. Yeah.
Well, the Glorious Revolution was led by the Dutch, by a Anglo infiltrator in the House of Orange, because he was 75% English, genetically speaking, and he was invited by the Parliament of England to come be the king, because he wasn't a Catholic, so they kicked out James, and then he sort of backstabbed us, and he handed all the naval and military power over to the English. This is, for example, those orange sashes they wear in Ireland, the Protestants wear in Ireland? It's because of the Dutch, because we came to help them against the Catholics, the Jacobins.
Well, yeah, the orange is the orange. Yeah, it's essentially a religious fight. I mean, much of that was between the Habsburgs and the French. Was it Philip Sidney fighting in the Low Countries as early as, fighting with the French and other Catholic powers as early as the 16th century, right? Orange has been symbolic of that. Yeah, Spanish.
By the 17th century, we had defeated the Habsburg Spanish, and our biggest enemy had become the French.
Catholic French, right? Yeah. Okay.
But it had less to do with religion. It had more to do with the fact that Louis XIV was very expansionist. We were a very rich region, and so we were a target for conquest.
All those merchants in their coffee houses, even to the point that Louis XIV was willing to, and others probably were willing to take on 6'5" people, 300 and something pounds. You eat 2 pounds of cheese daily. Okay, probably were. Variatus of Lusitania says Semiagog tell Faust his Portuguese was pretty good, and yes, he's Portuguese, so he's in a position to say. Well, then we have a couple minutes left. I think I'll just aim for 2 hours here, since you've been patient enough to hold through with this. That gives us about 10 or 12 more minutes. We'll take some questions from people who are enjoying asking someone from.
I think I've made pretty much all the points I wanted to make. The folk culture references and so on as well. So.
All right. Well, then we'll just pick your brain. Waldo Lebdowski says, Semiagog, if Faust's people are so superior, why was Styx a better choice for a young Dutch girl than a native superior Dutchman?
We don't talk about that.
All right. Well, I guess, it's because there's no good answer.
There's no good answer there. Just going to have to deport them both.
All right. There it is. This is a question, actually. I think
she used to have a YouTube channel, did you know, where she talked about a bit of right-wing philosophy. Yeah, that's gone now.
I didn't realize. Well, it's only fit for the woman once married to disappear into the domestic interior of the house, right?
Oh yeah, that's true.
True. Tommy Spade is how would Faust, and I think Woz was asking about this too in terms of Belgium. I think Woz asked what should be done with Belgium or about Belgium. Tommy Spade says, how would Faust describe neighboring Belgium without government for over a year of society compared to the Dutch, etc. So just generally, what's your take on Belgium? I guess
the Netherlands.
There we are. They'll call it that. What were once called the Low Countries, right? This artificial state that has the French speakers on one side and the Dutch speakers on the other.
Wallonia is the French speaking and Flanders is the Dutch speaking, but it's more complex than that because you also have French, France-Vlaanderen, which is a region of France which is Dutch speaking but is no longer part of Belgium. And then historically the provinces of Picardy and Artesia were also Dutch speaking but are now French speaking. This all used to be the Duchy of Lotharingen, and the Burgundians. The House of Burgundy was the one who eventually reunited it mostly. And we were split in 1830 by a rebellious Frenchman, Dutch who became Francophones. The perspective of pretty much every Dutch nationalist and even a lot of people in the normal Dutch right wing is that we're going to just take Belgium back, basically. I think when opinion polling was like 80% of Dutch people support reunification with Belgium, and between 30 or 40% of Flemish support reunification. The main barrier to reunification are the Francophones, the Wallonians, but they're all socialists and they are all unemployed. So I'm not sure why we take their opinion for anything.
And if that country were to be divided up, where would the Francophone contingent go?
Well, in my opinion, we take them as well and we re-educate them to speak Dutch because they are ethnically Dutch.
So it really is just a linguistic, cultural
It's a linguistic
divide?
issue. If you take the genetic Dutch population, it reaches throughout a lot of northern France as well, about almost all the way to Paris.
Along the Atlantic there?
Yeah, along the Atlantic, but also part of the interior. These are the provinces of Picardy and Artesia. For example, Calais in Dutch is Calais, and Arras is Atrecht in Dutch.
That means that wogs really don't begin at Calais.
There's some
Or that means that the English are trying
Dutch
to say a
there.
really
Yeah,
nasty
yeah.
thing about the Dutch. Okay.
The traditional Dutch saying is that Southern Europe starts at the Rhine.
All right. Well, there it is. We have John Plum is saying, Semigog, ask Woz on the show. Woz has a standing invitation to come on whenever he wants. All he has to do is say so and what he wants to talk about.
I'll urge Woz to just deal with that issue that he has and just start making content again.
Absolutely. I agree. Not having any Woz clips is, straighten it out, man. By God, man. What is next? We have 8 minutes left. Something about a Don Charlemagne debate that I'm not familiar with.
Does he mean the neo-reactionary street YouTuber?
I don't know. It just says, what is your view on the Don Charlemagne debate? And I'm not.
No idea.
Yeah, I'm sorry to say I don't know either. Waldo Ladowski says, is Paul Verhoeven's movie Spetters an accurate description of Dutchmen?
I'm not familiar with that one. I know Turks Fruit. I'd say Verhoeven. Paul Verhoeven is the one who made RoboCop and Starship Troopers.
Right.
And he was attempting to satirize the right wing with that. And the funny thing I always found is whenever you try to satirize the right wing, a certain segment of the right wing will always go, that's fantastic, let's do that. This is the case, for example, with Warhammer 40k, Judge Dredd. There will always be a segment of the right wing that goes, this is a great idea, why aren't we doing this? And this kind of goes with RoboCop as well. Paul Verhoeven is a salon socialist, is what we call him. And his movies are mostly representative of the Dutch culture of the 70s and 80s and of Amsterdam. I don't think much of his movies are representative of what the Netherlands is really about.
All right. Well, then we have we're coming up on our ending here. So we'll see if any last question comes in. But in their absence at the moment, please take a minute, unhurried, to tell people where they can find your content, what your content is about, what different places they can follow you so that you get a proper plug.
Right. So my English language content is on a YouTube channel called Faust, just called Faust. That's mostly just my personal reflections on things. Mostly, like I did address some of the things, philosophy, technology, economy, mostly because I studied economics. It's what I know most about, strictly speaking. I also do podcasts sometimes with other Europeans because I'm of the opinion that too much is on the Anglos and the Americans. So I try to do podcasts with other European countries like Norway, Austria, Portugal, sort of kind of elevate their presence on, because that's the thing, you Anglos and Americans are so dominant. There's very little other content in nationalist circles from our little countries. So that's what I do there. And occasionally I make meme videos. And I have a Dutch channel called Dietse Bazuin. It's all in Dutch, so it's less interesting for you. The idea of this is basically to do PragerU style videos with little animations and stuff with high production value, talking about, at this point it's become much more about data. So for example, I released a video today about George Soros, and it talks about everything he financed. So it's financial reports, like what institutions he has funded, to what goal, and so on. So it's a very data-driven sort of platform. But the idea is to sort of imitate the PragerU style to be widespread among also the more populist, liberal, centrists, and try to radicalize them a little bit by slowly pulling them in. And I also publish under the same name, Dietse Bazuin, a culture magazine, which is mostly focused on Dutch and Flemish history, folk tales, festivals, poetry, these sorts of things.
And where do people find that magazine? How would they?
Then you have to speak Dutch. It's mostly published on React News, Rechtsactueel, which is a Flemish website.
And do you have Telegram or any other social media?
I would have Twitter, but I get banned off there, so no, I'm mostly just on YouTube.
Okay, so YouTube is your thing. Okay, well then, with our remaining 3 minutes, it looks like we have a final question, and that is again from Kathleen Batavian, and it is ask Faust, Wilders or Baudet?
Neither really, but if you really have to pick, at this point I'd say Wilders, simply because he's predictable and he's more likely to get a larger share of the vote, so to be a larger hindrance to the establishment. The question is between the two biggest populist politicians in the Netherlands. Baudet's a little bit more intellectual and has had more reactionary pronouncements in the past. And Wilders is, you probably know Geert Wilders, anti-Islam and so on. Both are Zionists, both are pretty liberal. But with Forum for Democracy and Baudet, it's basically that they've sort of betrayed the trust of a lot of their more nationalist supporters. So at this point, I wouldn't give my my vote to them.
All right, and I had someone ask specifically about your channel. Jules Roy came in and said, "Can you link his channel?" It's not coming up when I search.
I'll put a comment, and then you can...
Yeah, do put it in the comments so they can find you. I think I just found it here. It says Fausto Lancer 1.
Yeah, that's the
YouTube one, and that's the English one, correct? Yeah.
Yeah, it's a guy drinking a glass. It's me drinking a glass of whiskey.
Got it. I just plugged that in. Hopefully you guys will be able to find it in the chat. Let me see if there's any last remark here. It doesn't seem there is. Well, then what I will do first off is to say, everyone, please take a look at his content. The whole idea is that none of us are going to grow without support directly from channels where we're guests, because the algorithm is already designed not only to make it impossible to grow, but quite the opposite, to shave off subscribers when they come in. I mean, I cannot emphasize enough how important it is that you let other folks know that these different content creators are out there, and try to give them a leg up and get them some more eyeballs on their content. If you like them, there's nothing's being forced here. So yeah, please do check out his content. Please do share it with others, because that's the only way we're going to grow. And yeah, Faust, sir, directly, thank you very much for coming on. I appreciate
I'd like
you.
to say as well that I find like I have a strong dislike for a lot of the channels that just talk about the news all the time. This is why I think your channel, which is why I wanted to come on your channel, because I think your channel has a unique take in that it mostly discusses geopolitics, which is fairly lacking, I think, and a good take on geopolitics is also important. And also I like the little, how do you call it, kunst, the artistic things you do mostly on Twitter as well. And I read some of your stuff in Elsevier, Dutch magazine.
Oh,
so.
did you? Did you?
Yeah,
Yes, that's on the Marx and Market. Yeah, well, yeah, you're one of the few.
Well, yeah, I was curious. So yeah, I like I don't hate Americans necessarily, all of them. So I like talking to the more intelligent ones in the hope that you'll steer your compatriots right, perhaps.
Yeah. I think given how you feel about all of this, unless I have, a pretty large caliber pistol. I mean, Jesus Christ, 6'5" and 300 plus pounds. I want a 45 with plus P's or something. But yeah, I'd rather speak to you from a distance, given how you feel about my people. Yeah, but I'm sure, between men of goodwill, all differences are small.
Yeah. And in Europe, we have an event called Kampf der Nibelungen. So if you ever want to go for an MMA tournament, it's always a possibility.
Did you say Nibelung? What?
Kampf der Nibelungen. Yeah, it's an annual fighting tournament for nationalists in Germany.
For nationalists?
Yes.
Jesus Christ, I have a little bit of experience fighting. I don't want to fight anybody who's 6'5" and 300 whatever pounds. I just no. But really, that's why God made pistols. I mean, yeah, somebody in my own weight class and my own age, sure, yeah, that could be fun. I've been punched in the face enough. I want to keep my teeth. Dentistry's expensive, broken noses. Yeah, well, there it is, ladies and gentlemen. This was Faust in the house.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Indeed, sir. Thank you. Thank everyone for checking out the content, and I'll be back with other discussions with other people in future, and maybe we'll even have Faust back on for other discussions. And yeah, Woes has a standing invitation to come on anytime. So yeah, ladies and gentlemen, I am Semigog, and I